Some boundaries aren't drawn with words, but with quiet actions that speak volumes about self-respect. Jake stood in his transformed Seattle apartment, hand resting on Max's broad head, as the Great Dane watched him hang a cherished family photo that had been relegated to storage during Emma's residency. His fingers trembled slightly as he straightened the frame, the echo of her mocking words still fresh. "Without marriage, you don't get a say in my plans." What would you do when the person sharing your home treats your dignity as optional? For Jake, the answer wasn't found in anger, but in something far more powerful: the methodical reclamation of his space, his boundaries, and ultimately his peace. The journey from accommodation to empowerment wasn't what he expected at 48, but it would prove to be his most important transformation. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Jake's Wallingford apartment, catching dust motes in beams of light. At 48, Jake Harmon had spent 20 years in this space, gradually transforming it from a starter apartment to a comfortable home that reflected his journey from struggling programmer to established IT security specialist. Jake adjusted the thermostat down 3 degrees after Emma left for work. She kept it uncomfortably warm, but he'd grown accustomed to putting on a sweater rather than suggesting a compromise. He moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, brewing coffee for 2, though Emma rarely acknowledged the gesture, clearing away dishes she'd left on the counter, and straightening the decorative pillows that had gradually multiplied on his once simple couch. His phone buzzed with a calendar reminder: dinner with Emma's friends on Friday. Jake noted that his own friends, the weekly poker group he'd once hosted, hadn't been over in nearly 6 months. Emma found them too loud, and their conversations repetitive. He'd accepted this assessment without argument, meeting them occasionally at a local bar instead. Jake settled at his desk in the corner of the living room, the space Emma had allocated for his work materials after converting the second bedroom into her creativity room. His gaze drifted to the wall where photos of his family, career achievements, and community involvement competed for space with Emma's modern art prints. Somehow her decorative choices had expanded while his contracted, a subtle shift he'd hardly noticed happening. "Just making our place more current," she'd say, whenever he expressed surprise at a new change. Our place. Though the mortgage was long paid off, solely in his name, and Emma's financial contributions remained minimal despite her substantial marketing salary. Jake opened his laptop to check on a security project, but found himself distracted by a photo partially hidden behind one of Emma's abstract prints. It showed Jake with his father at a Seahawks game, both wearing matching jerseys and wide smiles. His father had passed away 2 years ago, the same year Emma had moved in. The gradual obscuring of such memories hadn't happened all at once, but through small, incremental changes he'd permitted in the name of domestic harmony. When Jake returned home that evening, the apartment door swung open to reveal an unfamiliar silhouette where his father's recliner had stood for years. A sleek, angular chair with chrome accents had replaced the worn leather comfort where he'd sat with his father during the older man's final months. "What happened to Dad's chair?" The words emerged barely above a whisper. Emma looked up from her phone, surprise flickering briefly across her face before settling into casual dismissal. "Oh, I donated that old thing. This fits our aesthetic better, don't you think? The delivery guys just left." Jake's hand instinctively reached toward the empty space, as if he might still feel the worn leather under his fingertips. "That chair was where I sat with my father before he died. We watched every Seahawks game of his last season there. Jake, you can't keep hanging on to every sentimental item forever. It's called hoarding." Emma rolled her eyes as a knock sounded at the door. "That's probably Mrs. Thompson about the building meeting." The elderly woman stood in the hallway, her posture still carrying the authority of her years on the bench as a family court judge. At 72, Mrs. Thompson missed little, her sharp eyes taking in Jake's stunned expression and the new chair behind him. "Redecorating?" she asked, glancing between them. "Just helping Jake update," Emma replied brightly. "He gets attached to the oddest things, Mrs." Thompson's gaze lingered on Jake, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Sometimes attachments have deeper meanings than appearances suggest," she said quietly. After delivering her invitation to the community meeting, Mrs. Thompson departed, leaving Jake to process his loss privately. He sat gingerly in the new chair, finding it aesthetically pleasing but uncomfortable, much like his relationship had become. That night, Jake lay awake beside Emma's sleeping form, replaying the day's events. Had there been other losses he'd accepted too readily? Other boundaries crossed that he'd dismissed as unimportant? The chair wasn't just furniture. It represented moments with his father that couldn't be replaced, conversations that had shaped him, comfort during grief that Emma had deemed disposable. Later that week, while Emma attended her yoga class, Jake found himself helping Mrs. Thompson with her computer. Her apartment stood in stark contrast to his, photos and mementos proudly displayed, each telling a story she shared freely. "Tea preference?" she asked, offering choices rather than assuming. "Earl Grey, if you have it," Jake replied, struck by how long it had been since someone had asked his preference about anything. Mrs. Thompson's apartment felt like a personal museum, each object carefully chosen and maintained. A framed court certificate hung beside family photos spanning decades. Books lined shelves without concern for color coordination or aesthetic. The space felt authentic, lived in, respected. "It's interesting how differently people view personal possessions," Mrs. Thompson observed, handing him a steaming cup. "In my years as a judge, I saw how often fundamental differences in values emerge in what might seem like simple disagreements about objects." Jake nodded, feeling seen in a way he hadn't in months. "I keep telling myself relationships require compromise." "Indeed they do," she agreed. "But there's a difference between compromise and surrender. One respects both parties. The other diminishes one for the benefit of the other." As Jake left, Mrs. Thompson's words lingered, planting seeds of awareness about patterns he'd been ignoring. He resolved to pay closer attention to the dynamics he'd accepted as normal. 3 days later, Jake was using the shared tablet to check sports scores when a notification slid across the top of the screen. Confirmation: Oceanside Resort Spa, 2 guests, King Suite. Before he could process the information, Emma snatched the tablet from his hands. "Just work stuff," she said, dismissing the notification with unusual haste. "The agency is planning a client retreat." Jake nodded, but something in her quick defensiveness registered as discordant. That evening, he noticed Emma had changed passwords on several accounts they previously shared. When he mentioned it casually over dinner, she cited a security breach at her office requiring everyone to update their passwords. "You of all people should understand the importance of cybersecurity," she added, subtly shifting any questioning back to his expertise, a tactic he now recognized as deflection. A pattern began to emerge. Emma's girls' nights were increasing in frequency, yet the social media posts he occasionally saw showed different participants than she'd mentioned. Credit card statements, which Jake handled since Emma found financial matters tedious, showed purchases at boutiques and salons she never mentioned. Jake started a discreet note on his secure work laptop, documenting discrepancies, dates that didn't align, explanations that shifted, defensive reactions to simple questions. His security training had taught him to look for patterns, and now those professional skills were revealing uncomfortable truths in his personal life. Phone conversations would stop abruptly when Jake entered a room. Emma's phone remained face down beside her, notifications silenced, yet she checked it constantly. When Jake asked simple questions about her day, answers became increasingly vague, often followed by criticism of his need to know everything. "Don't you trust me?" became her standard response to any questioning, inverting his legitimate concerns into character flaws on his part. The most troubling discovery came when Jake found mail addressed to Emma at an apartment across town, a place she had supposedly given up when moving in with him 2 years ago. The envelope contained a utility bill showing minimal but active usage. "Just keeping it as a backup office space," she explained when confronted. "Sometimes I need quiet to focus on big projects. You're reading too much into this." Jake found himself at Mrs. Thompson's door again, ostensibly to help with printer issues, but really seeking the clarity her presence provided. As they waited for documents to print, he carefully broached the subject. "Have you ever felt like you're seeing patterns others insist aren't there?" Mrs. Thompson placed a delicate china teacup before him. "In my courtroom, I learned to trust patterns over explanations. People's behaviors tell more truth than their words." Jake hesitated before continuing. "Emma seems different lately, more secretive. I've noticed she refers to your apartment as hers when speaking to delivery people," Mrs. Thompson offered gently. "And there's a dismissiveness in her tone when you speak that many residents have commented on." The validation of his perceptions washed over Jake like cool water. He wasn't imagining things. "Just last week," Mrs. Thompson continued, "she told the package courier to leave your delivery with her because, and I quote, 'I make the decisions about what comes into my home.' I found it peculiar given that you've owned this apartment for 2 decades. Jake's professional training kicked in. That's a significant data point. "In my experience," Mrs. Thompson continued, "patterns of disrespect rarely improve without acknowledgement and genuine desire to change. They simply become more entrenched when unchallenged." That evening, Jake attempted reasonable communication about his concerns. They sat at the dining table, his words carefully chosen to express feelings without accusations. "I've noticed some changes lately," he began. "I feel like there's a growing distance between us." Emma barely looked up from her phone. "You're being oversensitive." "Everything's fine. The secret phone calls, password changes, the apartment you kept, these things suggest otherwise." "I never said that was a secret," Emma countered, finally setting down her phone with visible irritation. "You're remembering it wrong. And checking my mail. That feels controlling." Jake maintained his calm. "I wasn't checking your mail. It was delivered here by mistake. Still, the fact that you opened it, I didn't open it. The bill information is printed on the envelope." Emma's apology came quickly, but without substance. "I'm sorry you feel insecure. That's not my intention." Before Jake could respond, she pivoted. "This is why I need my space sometimes. Your expectations can be suffocating." Jake noticed how she positioned his reasonable concerns as character flaws, her own behaviors as natural responses to his problems. This pattern of reversal had become so common he'd stopped noticing it. The conversation ended with Emma announcing an upcoming girls' trip to the coast. When Jake asked basic questions, which friends, which hotel, how many days, her defensiveness spoke volumes. "Why the interrogation? Don't you have your own friends to worry about? Oh, wait, you barely see them anymore." The subtle dig reminded Jake of how his social circle had contracted during their relationship. "Accept me as I am, or we have a problem," she concluded, leaving the apartment with phone in hand, texting someone immediately upon exiting. Jake sat in the uncomfortable chrome chair, the realization settling heavily. Talking wouldn't solve their problems because Emma had no interest in honest communication. Whatever was happening, he would need to find answers himself. The weekend before Emma's scheduled trip arrived with unusual tension. Jake noticed 3 new shopping bags in the closet, tags still attached to expensive clothes he'd never seen. While Emma showered, curiosity and growing unease led him to check her travel details on their shared laptop. The browser history had been cleared, unusual for Emma, who typically forgot such technical matters, but the email account remained logged in. Jake didn't have to search long before finding what he feared: confirmation for a romantic weekend package at Oceanside Resort Spa, including couples massages and a sunset dinner cruise. Most telling was the reservation detail. "Welcome back, Ms. Caldwell and Mr. Denton." Ryan Denton, Emma's ex-boyfriend from before their relationship, supposedly now just a casual friend in her extended circle. Jake's security specialist instincts kicked in. He took screenshots, saved them to his secure cloud storage, and closed the laptop exactly as he'd found it. Professional habits of documentation would serve him well now. When Emma emerged from the bathroom, he stood in the hallway, email printout in hand. "Is there something you want to tell me about this weekend?" Emma's expression shifted from surprise to annoyance. "You're going through my emails now. That's a serious invasion of privacy. I notice you're not denying what's in them." "It's not what you think," she started, then stopped, assessing his expression. Something in Jake's unwavering gaze must have signaled this wouldn't be dismissed easily. Her strategy shifted. "Fine. Ryan and I have reconnected. We're exploring possibilities. While living in my home, using my financial support." Emma's laugh held no warmth. "Your home. I've lived here for 3 years. I've made this place livable." "You've made it yours, not ours," Jake corrected quietly. "And you've contributed minimally, while I've covered the majority of our expenses. Is that what this is about? Money?" Emma's voice rose as she moved toward the door, suitcase already packed. "I didn't realize you were keeping score." Jake followed, aware they were now in the hallway where sound carried to neighboring apartments. "This is about honesty and respect, not money." Emma turned, her voice deliberately loud enough to carry. "Without marriage, you don't get a say in my plans. That was your choice, remember. I'm an independent woman, not your property. My friend and I are going to enjoy this trip, whether you like it or not." The word friend dripped with mockery. Jake stepped back, as if physically struck, suddenly aware of Mrs. Thompson standing in her doorway, witness to his public humiliation. Emma departed without further comment, the elevator doors closing on her satisfied expression. Jake stood frozen until Mrs. Thompson gently guided him back to his apartment. "Breathe," she instructed simply, her presence anchoring him as the full impact of Emma's betrayal crashed through his carefully constructed accommodations. "I should have seen this coming," Jake said finally, sitting heavily on the couch. "Perhaps you did, but weren't ready to acknowledge it," Mrs. Thompson suggested. "The mind protects us from painful truths until we're strong enough to face them." 3 years, Jake murmured. 3 years of adjusting, accommodating, making space. "And now it's time to reclaim that space," Mrs. Thompson said firmly. "Not out of vengeance, but self-respect." When Mrs. Thompson left an hour later, Jake sat alone in the silence of his apartment. No, his apartment, and allowed the truth to crystallize. Every dismissed concern, every explanation he'd accepted, every boundary he'd surrendered, formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. His breathing steadied as shock gave way to clarity. Jake moved to his computer desk, security specialist skills awakening after months of dormancy. With methodical precision, he began documenting everything: financial contributions to household expenses, showing his 80% share despite Emma's higher salary; text messages, revealing patterns of deception; recordings of conversations, including today's hallway declaration, legal in Washington's one-party consent state. Jake reviewed bank statements showing his mortgage payments and property taxes, solely his responsibility throughout their relationship. He compiled credit card statements revealing Emma's personal purchases charged to accounts he paid. He documented the gradual takeover of his space: furniture replacements, decorative changes, room repurposing, all without meaningful consultation. As the evidence accumulated on his screen, Jake felt something shifting within him. Not just anger, but resolve. The skills he'd applied professionally for decades could now protect his own interests. Emma had severely underestimated both his awareness and his capacity for strategic response. Jake's security training had taught him to identify vulnerabilities, assess threats, and implement protective measures. Now he would apply these principles to his personal life methodically and effectively. Jake reached for his phone, scrolling to contacts he hadn't used in months. First, Michael Keating, college friend and property attorney. Second, Mrs. Thompson, whose judicial experience might provide invaluable guidance. Third, the building manager, whose cooperation he would need. "My home, my life, my terms now," Jake whispered, the declaration settling around him not as vengeance, but as necessary reclamation. Before sleeping, Jake found himself browsing an unexpected website, the Seattle Animal Shelter's adoption page, where a 3-year-old Great Dane named Max stared back from the screen with dignified patience. Something about the dog's steady gaze resonated with Jake's newfound determination. For the first time in months, Jake slept soundly, plans forming even in his dreams. 20 years in IT security gives you an advantage most people wouldn't have, Michael observed, reviewing Jake's methodically organized documentation. They sat in Michael's downtown office the next morning, spreadsheets and recordings arranged with professional precision. "I've spent my career protecting clients from exploitation. Ironic that I missed it in my own home," Jake replied, the initial shock now replaced by focused determination. "Many intelligent people miss relationship red flags," Michael assured him. "The good news is, Washington state law clearly favors you here. The apartment is solely in your name, purchased before your relationship. Without marriage or a formal domestic partnership filing, Emma has limited legal standing." Jake nodded, memories surfacing of Emma's resistance whenever he mentioned formalizing their relationship. "She always said marriage was an outdated institution, that our commitment shouldn't need paper validation. I respected that position." "While she maintained a separate apartment as insurance," Michael noted. "That demonstrates clear intent and undermines any claim of permanent residency she might make." They outlined a strategic approach: proper documentation of Emma's belongings, legal notification procedures, secure storage of her possessions, and timeline management to avoid any claims of unlawful eviction. "Change the locks only after she's clearly established she's left," Michael advised. "Have witnesses for everything. Document meticulously." "Documentation is my specialty," Jake replied with a hint of his old confidence. "One more thing," Michael added. "Washington's recording laws permit one-party consent, but be careful about recordings in areas where there's an expectation of privacy." Common areas of your apartment and building hallways are fine, but avoid private spaces. Jake appreciated the precision of legal boundaries, clear, enforceable, and respected when properly implemented. So unlike the emotional manipulation he'd endured, where boundaries shifted according to Emma's preferences. That afternoon, Jake met with Mrs. Thompson in her apartment, the retired judge providing both legal insights and emotional wisdom. The courts see patterns, she confirmed, echoing her earlier observations. Emma's maintenance of a separate residence, while benefiting from yours, creates a clear picture of opportunism rather than commitment. I keep asking myself if I'm overreacting, Jake admitted. Mrs. Thompson's expression remained compassionate but firm. Consider her words in the hallway. Without marriage, you don't get a say. She explicitly used your respect for her autonomy against you, weaponizing your consideration as a weakness. That clarified everything, Jake acknowledged. I kept adjusting my expectations to maintain peace, but there was never going to be enough accommodation to satisfy her. In my courtroom, I saw many cases where reasonable people surrendered reasonable boundaries until they reached a breaking point, Mrs. Thompson said. The healthiest outcome isn't vengeance, but reclamation of what rightfully belongs to you, not just property, but dignity. The validation strengthened Jake's resolve. I don't want revenge. I just want my home and peace of mind back. The most powerful responses often come not from emotional reaction, but from principled action. Mrs. Thompson observed, "You have community support here. Many residents have witnessed Emma's attitude over time." Jake felt a weight lifting as he realized he wasn't alone. His professional community respected him. His building neighbors had seen the truth. His old friends remained available despite the distance Emma had created. The next day, Jake met briefly with his building manager, Roberto, explaining the situation and confirming procedures for changing locks. As the sole owner, you have every right, Roberto confirmed. Just provide proper written notice once the change is made. I'm happy to serve as witness for any property inventory you conduct. Roberto hesitated, then added, "My wife and I noticed how Miss Caldwell speaks to you at community events. It's not respectful. We've been concerned." This additional confirmation from yet another neighbor reinforced what Jake was learning. Others had seen the disrespect long before he allowed himself to recognize it. With his support network established, Jake turned to implementation planning. He created a detailed timeline centered around Emma's trip, which would provide the 3-day window needed for the transformation. He prepared an inventory spreadsheet for Emma's possessions, arranged for a storage unit rental, and scheduled a locksmith for the day after her departure. Jake also contacted the animal shelter to arrange a meeting with Max. The Great Dane's previous owner had surrendered him after moving to a no-pets apartment, another life disrupted by housing changes. "He's been waiting for the right match," the shelter worker explained during their phone conversation. "Great Danes bond deeply with their people. They need someone steady." The parallel wasn't lost on Jake. Both he and Max needed a fresh start based on loyalty rather than convenience. Each step of preparation brought increasing clarity and confidence. Jake felt muscles relaxing that had been tensed for months, as if his body had recognized the dysfunction before his mind fully acknowledged it. The evening before Emma's departure, Jake maintained normal routines, careful not to signal the changes to come. Emma remained distracted, her attention focused on her phone and upcoming trip. When she casually mentioned, "Don't wait up for me Sunday night, I might be late," Jake simply nodded, knowing Sunday would bring changes she couldn't anticipate. After Emma left Friday morning, Wheeled suitcase in tow, Jake waited 30 minutes to ensure she wouldn't return for forgotten items. Then he began executing his carefully constructed plan. First, he documented the apartment's current state with photographs and video. Next, he texted Michael and Mrs. Thompson, confirming their availability as witnesses for Saturday's inventory process. Finally, he contacted the shelter to confirm his appointment with Max that afternoon. Driving to the shelter, Jake reflected on Emma's claim that he was too old for a dog. At 48, he was hardly elderly, yet she had consistently positioned him as outdated, inflexible, set in his ways, language that subtly undermined his confidence and positioned her as the progressive, adaptable partner. As Jake drove, he noticed Seattle landmarks that had witnessed his 20-year journey in the city. The coffee shop, where he'd landed his first major contract. The park, where he'd recovered after his father's death. The community center, where he volunteered teaching coding to disadvantaged youth. This was his home, his community, his life story, not a backdrop for someone else's convenience. As Jake drove to the animal shelter, a sense of lightness replaced the heaviness that had accumulated over months of accommodation. Each decision now reflected his own preferences and priorities, a reclamation not just of space, but of self-determination. The Great Dane's dignified demeanor impressed Jake immediately. Despite his imposing size, Max moved with gentle awareness, his dark eyes reflecting a calm intelligence that suggested he'd seen his share of life's complexities. "He's been waiting for the right match," the shelter worker explained. "Great Danes bond deeply. They need someone steady." When Max leaned his substantial weight against Jake's leg in a gesture of tentative trust, the decision made itself. Some connections required no explanation. "We'll figure this out together," Jake promised, scratching behind the dog's velvety ears. Saturday morning arrived with purpose and clarity. Michael and Mrs. Thompson joined Jake as he carefully boxed Emma's belongings, creating a detailed inventory of each item. Roberto witnessed the process, occasionally helping with heavier objects. "Everything properly documented," Michael confirmed as they completed the task. "The storage unit is climate-controlled and secure." "You've gone above and beyond legal requirements." Jake had been surprised by the sheer volume of Emma's possessions, far more than he'd realized had accumulated in his space. Clothing filled multiple wardrobes. Makeup and personal care items occupied most of the bathroom storage. Decorative objects had displaced his own mementos throughout the living areas. "It's quite something to see it all gathered together," Mrs. Thompson observed, "like watching your space materialize again as her things are removed." They transported Emma's possessions to the storage facility, Jake securing the unit with a new lock. He left printed notification inside with the key and access information and emailed the same details to Emma, copying Michael to establish legal documentation. "Your email is perfect," Michael approved. "Professional, factual, without emotional language." It clearly establishes that her belongings are safely stored and accessible to her, while formally noting your decision to end the cohabitation arrangement. Returning to the increasingly empty apartment, Jake felt both the space and himself expanding into the vacuum Emma's possessions had left. He retrieved his original furniture from the building's storage area, comfortable pieces chosen for durability and meaning rather than trend compliance. His father's chair, thankfully, had never made it to donation. Jake had intercepted it from the building's donation collection area the day Emma discarded it, storing it with Roberto's help. Now it returned to its rightful place by the window, the leather worn but intact, carrying memories no chrome and minimalist design could replace. Jake uncovered his jazz record collection, relegated to storage boxes when Emma deemed it cluttering. He rehung family photos that told the story of his journey. He reclaimed closet space for his own clothing, no longer cramming his belongings into a fraction of the available storage. "This feels like an archaeological dig," he joked to Mrs. Thompson as they discovered a box of his books that Emma had packed away as too intellectual-looking for display. "You're excavating your authentic self," she replied with understanding. "It's important work." By evening, the locksmith had changed the locks, providing Jake with new keys and security codes. Roberto confirmed the process complied with building regulations since Jake was the sole owner of record. Sunday morning brought the final transformation. Jake and Max returned from the shelter, the Great Dane cautiously exploring his new home, while Jake arranged the dog's bed, bowls, and toys. The apartment, now reflecting Jake's preferences, warm woods, comfortable seating, and family photos restored to prominence, felt like his own again. Jake's phone buzzed with increasingly agitated texts from Emma, who had discovered his email. "What gives you the right to touch my things? This is my home, too. You can't just throw me out. This is illegal. I'm contacting a lawyer. You'll regret this." Jake responded with a single text. "All communications should go through Michael Keating," followed by his attorney's contact information. Then he silenced notifications from Emma's number, focusing instead on helping Max settle in. That afternoon, they walked through the neighborhood, Max's dignified presence drawing smiles from passers-by. Several building residents stopped to meet the new resident, expressing delight at Jake's expanded family. "He suits you," Mrs. Thompson observed when they passed her in the lobby. "There's a similar steadiness in both of you." For the first time in years, Jake felt fully present in his neighborhood, noticing changes in local businesses, greeting neighbors by name, experiencing the community he'd helped build over 2 decades. Jake had just returned to the apartment and was arranging some books on shelves previously occupied by Emma's decorative objects, when his security system alerted him to activity at the door. The camera showed Emma, a day earlier than expected, attempting to use her key in the changed lock. Max moved to Jake's side as Emma's knocking became pounding. "Jake, open this door right now! What have you done?" Taking a deep breath, Jake opened the door, but remained in the threshold, Max sitting calmly beside him. Emma's expression transformed from anger to shock as she registered both the dog and the visible changes to the apartment behind him. "What is that?" she demanded, pointing at Max. "And why can't I get in?" "My key doesn't work." "The locks have been changed," Jake confirmed calmly. "Your belongings are in storage. The information was sent to your email yesterday." "You can't do this. I live here." Emma attempted to push past him, but Jake remained firmly in place. "No, Emma, you don't. You maintain a separate residence, as you've now confirmed. This apartment is solely in my name. Our cohabitation arrangement has ended." Emma's voice rose, echoing down the hallway. "You think you can just throw me out? After everything I've done for you, this place would be a dump without me. You're nothing but a boring old man who got lucky I stayed as long as I did." Neighbors' doors opened as the commotion continued. Mrs. Thompson appeared in her doorway, observing quietly. Roberto emerged from the elevator, witnessing Emma's behavior. "All of your possessions have been carefully packed and stored," Jake continued evenly, aware of the audience, but focused on maintaining boundaries. "The storage unit information is in your email. Any further communication should go through Michael." Emma's gaze darted around, registering the neighbors witnessing her meltdown. Her voice lowered, but retained its venom. "You've turned everyone against me, gotten your little building friends to take your side." "No one needed to take sides, Emma. People have eyes and ears," Jake replied simply. "This isn't over," Emma hissed, finally noticing the recording light on Jake's security camera. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." As she stormed toward the elevator, Jake closed and locked his door, his heart pounding, but his resolve intact. Max leaned against his leg, offering silent support. "That went about as expected," Jake told the dog, scratching his ears. "Phase 1 complete." Later that evening, Jake shared a quiet dinner with Max before settling in his father's chair with a book he'd been wanting to read for months. The apartment felt different, not just in arrangement but in atmosphere. The tension that had permeated the space had dissipated, replaced by a peace he'd forgotten was possible. When his phone indicated an email from Michael, Jake wasn't surprised to learn Emma had indeed contacted an attorney. Her claims of tenant rights and demands for immediate access would now move to proper legal channels, exactly as he'd anticipated. Jake updated his social media for the first time in months, posting a simple photo of Max resting beside the chair, captioned, "New Beginnings. Meet Max, the newest resident of Harmon Home." The post accumulated likes and supportive comments, including several from mutual friends who seemed surprised by this development in Jake's typically predictable life. The quiet reclamation was becoming public knowledge, and Jake found he welcomed the transparency after months of hiding concerns. Max sighed contentedly in his sleep, the Great Dane already adapting to his forever home with the resilience animals often show. Jake felt a similar adaptation happening within himself, a return to authenticity that felt both new and familiar simultaneously. The formal notice of Emma's lawsuit arrived 3 days later, alleging unlawful eviction and claiming tenant rights, despite her name never appearing on lease or ownership documents. Michael responded with a comprehensive legal brief supported by Jake's meticulous documentation. "Her case has significant weaknesses," Michael explained during their review meeting. "Her maintained separate residence undermines claims of permanent domicile. Your financial records show clear disparity in contribution. Most damaging is her documented statement about marriage being required for you to have a say, which demonstrates her own understanding of the arrangement's limitations." Jake nodded, relieved that his methodical approach was proving effective. "What should I expect next?" "She'll likely escalate before retreating," Michael predicted. "People who rely on manipulation often double down when conventional tactics fail. Be prepared for social pressure, attempts to sway mutual friends, perhaps even financial demands beyond housing." Michael's prediction proved accurate. Within days, Emma launched a social media campaign portraying herself as the victim of sudden abandonment. "After 3 years building a life together, came home to find myself homeless, possessions in storage, locks changed. Beware who you trust with your heart." Several mutual friends contacted Jake, confused by the conflicting narratives. Jake responded with minimal information. "This is a private matter, moving through appropriate legal channels. I appreciate your concern." Some friends pressed for details, suggesting he was being harsh or unfair to Emma. Jake recognized this as the flying monkeys phenomenon Mrs. Thompson had warned him about, people recruited to apply pressure and reinforce the manipulator's narrative. "You don't owe detailed explanations," Mrs. Thompson advised during their now regular tea sessions. "Those who matter will wait for truth to emerge. Those who pressure you for Emma's comfort weren't true friends to begin with." Mrs. Thompson proved an invaluable ally as the situation developed. Her reputation as a retired judge carried significant weight when she provided a sworn statement regarding Emma's hallway declaration and pattern of referring to the apartment as hers while contributing minimally. "The community has witnessed more than Emma realizes," she told Jake. Roberto has documentation of her attempting unauthorized access using the building master key, which violated building policy. She tried to get in using Roberto's key? Jake asked, surprised. 2 days ago, while you were at work. Roberto refused, of course, reminding her that unauthorized entry would constitute trespassing. She didn't appreciate the reminder. The legal proceedings moved forward with unexpected speed, assigned to a judge known for efficiency in civil matters. The hearing date was set for just 2 weeks after the initial filing, much sooner than Emma's attorney had anticipated based on typical court backlogs. Jake continued his daily routines, finding comfort in Max's companionship and the supportive community within his building. Sunday brunches became a new tradition, with Jake hosting small gatherings for neighbors in his reclaimed space. "Your apartment feels completely different now," observed Claire from the 3rd floor during one such brunch. "It's like the air itself has changed." "It's called peace," Roberto's wife Maria suggested, smiling at Max, who had become the building's unofficial therapy dog, making dignified rounds for gentle attention. Emma made one final attempt at manipulation before the hearing, sending a lengthy email suggesting they could work things out if Jake would drop the aggressive legal stance and allow her to return. The timing, just 3 days before court, revealed the tactical nature of this sudden reconciliation offer. "Classic pattern," Mrs. Thompson noted when Jake shared the email. "When boundary enforcement becomes real, expect sudden reform promises designed to reestablish access, not to create genuine change." Jake's response, crafted with Michael's guidance, remained consistent. All communication through legal channels only. On the morning of the hearing, Jake dressed carefully in a professional suit he hadn't worn since his father's funeral. Max seemed to sense the day's importance, staying close as Jake prepared to leave. "We'll be fine," Jake assured the dog. "This is just the formal conclusion." The courthouse presented a stark setting for their final confrontation. Emma arrived with her attorney, her expression shifting between confidence and concern as she noticed Mrs. Thompson seated behind Jake. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for cutting through pretense, reviewed the documents thoroughly before addressing the parties. Her questions revealed she had already identified the critical weaknesses in Emma's case. "Ms. Caldwell, your separate residence maintenance is troubling to this court," she noted. "Records indicate you maintained utility services at another address throughout your cohabitation with Mr. Harmon." Emma's attorney attempted to frame this as a career necessity, a quiet workspace for a busy professional, but the judge remained skeptical. "Mr. Harmon has provided substantial evidence of financial contribution disparity, with records showing he covered approximately 80% of household expenses despite your higher income, Ms. Caldwell. This suggests an arrangement of convenience rather than equal partnership." The most damaging moment came when the recording of Emma's hallway declaration played in the courtroom. Her clear statement, "Without marriage, you don't get a say in my plans," undermined her current claims of established domestic partnership rights. Emma shifted uncomfortably as her own words echoed through the courtroom. Her attorney leaned over, whispering urgently as they realized the impact of this evidence. Mrs. Thompson's testimony regarding Emma's pattern of behavior provided external validation from a respected judicial source. When Emma's attorney attempted to dismiss her observations as those of a nosy neighbor, the judge's expression hardened noticeably. "I find Mrs. Thompson's observations both relevant and credible given her professional background in family court matters," the judge stated firmly. Furthermore, I note that multiple building residents have provided affidavits supporting Mr. Harmon's characterization of the relationship dynamic. After brief deliberation, the judge issued her ruling. This court finds insufficient evidence to support claims of established tenancy rights. Mr. Harmon, as sole owner of the property, acted within his legal rights in terminating the cohabitation arrangement, particularly given evidence of Ms. Caldwell's maintenance of separate residence. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed with prejudice. Emma's face flushed with anger as the judge continued. I further note that Mr. Harmon's handling of Ms. Caldwell's possessions exceeded requirements under law, demonstrating consideration despite the relationship dissolution. Outside the courtroom, Emma attempted one final confrontation. You've turned everyone against me. This isn't over. Jake simply nodded to Michael, who stepped forward professionally. All future communications should continue through legal channels, Ms. Caldwell. Good day. As Jake and Mrs. Thompson walked from the courthouse, she placed a supportive hand on his arm. Living well is the best response now, she advised quietly. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of months of tension finally lifting completely. The legal validation confirmed what he had known internally. His boundaries were reasonable, his actions appropriate, his dignity worth protecting. Max is waiting, he replied simply, ready to return home, truly home, at last. The evening after the court decision, Jake sat in his father's chair, Max resting his substantial head on Jake's knee. The apartment was quiet except for gentle jazz playing from speakers Emma had deemed outdated, but which produced the warm sound Jake had always preferred. He felt an expected relief, but also a tinge of sadness, not for the relationship's end, which had been necessary, but for what it might have been had respect and honesty formed its foundation. Jake acknowledged these complex emotions without judgment, recognizing that victory and loss often intertwined in life's significant transitions. We did what was necessary, he told Max, who responded with a sympathetic gaze that suggested more understanding than many humans might offer. In the days that followed, Jake began removing the subtle constraints that had accumulated during his relationship with Emma. He called his old poker group, inviting them to resume their weekly games at his place. He reinstated his morning routine of coffee and reading on the balcony, a practice Emma had discouraged as wasting time. He reconnected with colleagues for after-work gatherings he'd gradually abandoned when Emma complained about his late returns. The weeks that followed brought a gradual settling into new rhythms. Jake resumed his weekly poker nights with friends long neglected during Emma's residency. He reclaimed hobbies she had dismissed as boring. His jazz collection expanded. His woodworking projects resumed in the building's shared workshop. His volunteer work with a youth coding program reactivated. Most significantly, Jake instituted Sunday brunches that quickly became a building tradition. The first gathering brought Mrs. Thompson, Roberto, and Maria, and several neighbors together around Jake's dining table, conversation flowing naturally among people who had lived as strangers under the same roof for years. You've created something special here, observed Claire, a retired teacher from the third floor, as Jake refilled coffee cups while Max made dignified rounds for gentle petting. Community happens when we make space for it, Jake replied, realizing how Emma had subtly discouraged these connections, preferring to keep their social circle limited to her younger friends who reinforced her perspectives. With each passing week, the brunches grew, sometimes spilling onto the building's rooftop garden in good weather. Different neighbors contributed signature dishes, stories were exchanged, and genuine connections formed across generations. Max became the unofficial host. His gentle presence especially calming for the children who occasionally joined. During one such brunch, Jason, a 30-something software developer new to the building, asked Jake how he'd known when to stand firm in his relationship situation, which many residents now knew about through courthouse records. Jake considered the question carefully. "I realized dignity isn't negotiable," he finally answered. There's a difference between compromise, which respects both people, and surrender, which diminishes one for the other's benefit. I confused the two for too long. Mrs. Thompson nodded approval from across the table. In 40 years on the bench, I observed that distinction repeatedly. The healthiest relationships maintain mutual respect regardless of legal status. "But how do you know where the line is?" Jason pressed, clearly working through his own relationship questions. "When explanations consistently replace apologies," Jake offered. "When your concerns are dismissed rather than addressed. When you find yourself changing to maintain peace while the other person remains fixed in their expectations." "That resonates," Jason admitted. "I've been dating someone who always explains why her behavior is justified, but never acknowledges how it affects me." The conversation continued, weaving between personal experiences and broader insights about relationships. Jake found himself comfortable in the role of experienced voice rather than dismissed old-fashioned thinker as Emma had often framed him. As spring arrived, Jake and Max established comfortable routines. Morning walks expanded their neighborhood connections. Evening reading sessions in the recliner became their shared meditation. Weekend explorations of Seattle parks replaced the social obligations that had dominated Jake's calendar during his relationship with Emma. Jake gradually reclaimed professional momentum as well. Freed from the constant emotional drain of managing Emma's expectations, he found renewed energy for his IT security work. He accepted a project mentoring young security specialists that he'd previously declined when Emma complained about his time commitments. The transformation extended beyond his apartment. Jake updated his wardrobe, not according to Emma's preferences for more youthful styles, but choosing quality pieces that reflected his actual taste and comfort. He booked a vacation to the Jazz Festival in New Orleans, a trip Emma had repeatedly vetoed as boring old people music. "You seem 10 years younger," Roberto commented during one of their building maintenance discussions. "It's like watching someone stand up straight after carrying a heavy pack." "That's exactly how it feels," Jake agreed. "I didn't realize how much energy maintaining that relationship consumed until it ended." 6 months after the court decision, Jake encountered Emma at a local coffee shop. She was alone, scrolling through her phone with the same intensity, he remembered, though her appearance suggested the intervening months had been less kind to her than to him. Their eyes met briefly before Emma looked away, gathering her things quickly to leave. No words were exchanged, but Jake noticed something that wouldn't have been visible to him before. The performance of confidence masking insecurity, the defensive posture, the absence of genuine connection with her surroundings. Walking home with Max after this chance encounter, Jake reflected on his journey from accommodation to empowerment. The Great Dane trotted beside him with characteristic dignity, occasionally acknowledging greetings from neighbors who now knew them both by name. "Jake! Max!" called Roberto's daughter from their front garden. "Dad's making paella this weekend and insists you both come." Jake waved acknowledgement, appreciating the simple joy of being known and valued in his community. He had created no social media narrative about his transformation, posted no triumphant declarations. The quiet reclamation of his space and dignity spoke for itself through the life he now lived. That evening, as Jake and Max settled into their comfortable routine, the dog in his bed beside the recliner, Jake with a book and soft music, he felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had ultimately led to greater authenticity. The apartment now truly reflected his journey. Photos of meaningful moments, books that had shaped his thinking, furniture chosen for comfort rather than impression. Most importantly, the space housed relationships based on mutual respect, beginning with Max, whose loyalty came without conditions, and extending to a community that valued Jake's contributions rather than demanding his accommodation. The transformation hadn't been instantaneous or without difficult moments. There had been lonely nights when Jake questioned his decisions. There had been awkward conversations with mutual friends who didn't understand the relationship's dissolution. There had been practical adjustments to daily routines built for two. Yet through it all, Jake had discovered something essential. Peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of dignity. True compromise honored both parties rather than requiring one person's consistent surrender. And sometimes, the quietest actions, changing locks, rearranging furniture, establishing boundaries, spoke more powerfully than any confrontation. As Max sighed contentedly in his sleep, Jake smiled at their shared contentment. New beginnings could arrive at any age, he reflected, when built on the foundation of self-respect that made all other authentic connections possible. The quiet reclamation of your space, physical, emotional, and spiritual, isn't selfish, but essential. Dignity isn't an optional luxury, but the foundation of any relationship worth having. Jake's journey reminds us that standing firm doesn't require dramatic confrontations, just the steady conviction that our boundaries matter. Many of us have experienced the gradual erosion of our needs and preferences, whether in family relationships, friendships, or romantic partnerships. We accommodate, adjust, and adapt, often without noticing how far we've drifted from our authentic selves. We mistake surrender for compromise, silence for peace. Age should bring increased respect, not dismissal. The wisdom earned through experience deserves acknowledgement rather than being labeled outdated or rigid. Jake's measured response demonstrated greater wisdom than Emma's reactive manipulation, showing that true strength lies not in controlling others, but in maintaining our own integrity. What boundaries might you need to reclaim in your own life? Where have accommodations become surrenders? Remember that the most powerful statements sometimes aren't spoken at all, but lived through quiet, determined actions that restore dignity one choice at a time. The legacy we create through standing firm isn't just for ourselves, but for everyone who witnesses what healthy boundaries look like. Like Jake's Sunday brunches, we can build communities of mutual respect that enrich rather than diminish the individuals within them. At any age, in any circumstance, beginning whenever we decide our dignity is non-negotiable. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Jake's experience is that true loyalty, to ourselves and others, isn't measured by endless accommodation, but by authentic presence. Max's straightforward companionship offered what Emma's complicated demands never could: relationship based on mutual appreciation rather than strategic advantage. Sometimes the simplest connections prove the most enduring, and the quietest revolutions create the most lasting peace.